Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Sophie, aka Peachy Craft. A couple of videos ago, I mentioned it might be fun to compare dry and wet gouache because I set up a dry gouache palette. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I've drew two stags. One of them has a yellow underpainting, and that's going to be the wet gouache. And then I'm going to start with the dry gouache side, which is not a stag, a doe, are they called? I don't know, a female one. So yeah, let's just get on into the video and see how these compare. Okay, so we are starting with the left side, which I will be using dry gouache for. All of the gouache that I'm using is the exact same brand. It's all Holbein gouache. The only difference is the left-hand side that I'm going to be painting with has been dried. I've put it into pans in a watercolor tin and left it to dry for, well, it's got to be months now. So it's extremely dry gouache. And the reason I started with the dry gouache side is I tend to find wet gouache tends to transfer more when you're painting. So because I'm right-handed, I didn't want to paint the wet gouache side first and then work on the left-hand side, just because I feel like my hand may end up smudging it just with the oils from your skin and things like that. So for the left-hand side, the dry gouache, I decided to draw a doe with its little tongue sticking out. And you can see I kind of work in layers. I did pre-wet the pans. I pre-wet them quite a lot, and I did have to wet them throughout the painting as well, because I did notice the water dried up super quickly. With dry gouache, I found it was really hard to reactivate it, and I had to scrub my brushes quite a lot in the pans to get pigment off. Which for me is definitely a negative, because my brushes are quite expensive. They're black velvet brushes, and they're quite delicate brushes as well, because they are intended for watercolour. So definitely scrubbing them in a pan isn't really recommended, because you don't want to damage the bristles. But that was one of the main cons for me, is it was just so hard to re-wet the pigment. But in terms of how the paints behaved, they definitely behaved more like watercolour rather than gouache itself. Gouache has quite a thick consistency and is quite opaque, whereas with these, particularly in the first few layers, you'll see it's very watercolour like. So if you're a watercolour artist and you wanted to try gouache but you don't particularly like the opacity of it, maybe let the paints dry a bit and use them as you would a watercolour, because they're definitely more pigmented than watercolour, but you can still achieve that transparency if you use it in watery consistencies. So for me, it behaved a lot like watercolour. I really enjoyed layering them on top of each other to get shadows and things like that. And I was quite surprised with re-wetting the white gouache to add the highlights at the end. I was a bit in doubt that it wouldn't really show, but it did definitely show on the patches of the fur where I added the white. There is kind of vague white highlights. They're not super intense, but they are there. I did try for the sparkles at the end using the white gouache as well, but it just wasn't pigmented enough for me, so I did go in with my Posca pen at the end anyway. But to be honest, I tend to always use a Posca pen with gouache just to add highlights, and it's kind of more controlled rather than trying to draw it with a paintbrush. The paints, they were nice to use. They definitely behaved like watercolour, which could be a pro or a con, I suppose. It's just a different way of using the gouache paints. And I really like the compactness of the tin. I've got mine in a Schminker whiskey flask, which can hold up to 12 colours, but I've only got 8 colours in here. And it was just really nice and compact. And I liked with the dry gouache, the colours didn't seem to contaminate easily. The palette stayed nice and clean. And I'll talk about that more when I'm talking about wet gouache, but the colours didn't contaminate in the pans, which was really good for me. So yeah, I did like them. They definitely behave more like watercolour, but I'll let you know my thoughts on the wet gouache, because I have a lot of thoughts on wet gouache. It's a medium I've used for a very long time. It's probably one of my favourite mediums, so I have a lot of I wouldn't say I'm an amazing painter with them, but I have a lot of experience with using them. So yeah, let's get on into the wet gouache painting. So for this one, on the right hand side, I started with an underpainting of yellow, which is a technique I love to use with gouache, because it just adds a lot of vividness to the paints that you apply on top. And I tend to leave gaps in the painting so you can see that bright or opaque colour shining through the painting itself. So that's definitely a pro of wet gouache for me, is that you can use an underpainting technique. With the dry gouache, I don't think you'd be able to, just because the colours are so transparent that it just may, if I were to use a yellow underpainting with the wet gouache, everything would look bright yellow because it would be hard to cover the yellow, if that makes sense. But yeah, painting with the wet gouache, I tend to start in quite a watery consistency, and I kind of let the colours flow into each other, which you see a lot with the blue and the brown. The colours flow into each other, creating a nice granulating technique, and I use this for shadows, I use it for texture. I just feel like it works really well, and it's a technique I like to use, which I couldn't really achieve with the dry gouache, just because it wasn't opaque enough to add that kind of texture. But yeah, so the colours themselves, I always re-wet my gouache palette anyway, my Stay Wet palette, just to really get the vibrancy of the colours, but they're so much easier to pick up pigment compared to the dry gouache, and that's because obviously they're not fully dry, they're still wet. So if you were looking for kind of brightness and opacity, I would definitely recommend using your gouache wet, just as the colour intensity is so much brighter, it's so much more vivid. Definitely with the dry gouache, the colours came out more pastel, and it was really hard to kind of build them to a rich opacity, unless I were to use the black. The black I used did get quite intense quite fast, but then it's a black, so you'd kind of expect it to anyway. So yeah, I really enjoy using wet gouache. I think you kind of can't really compare it. The creaminess of mixing wet gouache, the paint is just so creamy and it's just so fun to work with. If you've ever used wet gouache, you'll know what I mean. But you've really just got to experience it. I'd say a few cons about wet gouache. I use a Stay Wet palette, which is a really popular thing for people use. I got mine on Amazon, I think. It costs around £10. And it's basically got this silicone lid which seals the paint in. One of the cons to this is, I talked about contamination of colours. I find the wells, the colours seep into each other so easily, which can contaminate your colours. So it's definitely a lot more upkeep with trying to keep your colours clean. I find I have to use a tissue a lot to kind of dab out some colours if there's a bit of a mess in it. And it's a bit of a faff, but it's worth it if you want that opacity and that richness in your colours. You can also use gouache straight out the tube, but I tend to find I like having things to hand quickly. So definitely if you were to use gouache straight out the tube, there's a bit more setup. Your desk is a bit more messy because you've got paint tubes everywhere. So I would definitely recommend purchasing a Stay Wet palette if you wanted that easiness of using wet gouache, but you've still got to try and keep your palette clean. That's the only con of it. Whereas with the dry gouache, obviously the gouache is really dry, so re-wetting it, the colours don't tend to run into each other as much. So yeah, so kind of on setup wise, that would be the main cons and pros of it. But yeah, I just love wet gouache. I feel like it's just such a nice medium to use. And the dry gouache was fun to use as well. It was just a lot harder to reactivate, and it definitely behaves more like watercolor. So what I'd recommend, if you were wanting kind of a softer medium to wet gouache, to definitely try it dry. Just be aware that it may ruin your brushes a bit because you do have to scrub quite a lot, and also be kind of mindful of the colours that you choose. So in my dry gouache palette, I did have an opera pink, which is so hard to re-wet. I don't know why, but just the consistency of that colour once it's dry, it's almost impossible to re-wet. You really have to scrub it loads. Where I also have a magenta that is dried in that palette, and that was a lot easier to re-wet. So it's a bit of trial and error with what colours to use and things like that. It just depends on your painting style, I suppose, but definitely when they're in a stay wet palette, the colours are super easy to re-wet in comparison. And I just love the opacity of gouache. I feel like it's probably one of the main benefits to it. It's the fact that it's kind of in between acrylic and watercolor. Gouache is in that kind of range because it's more opaque, but it's still re-wettable like watercolor. So that's like, if you were to use dry gouache, which acts more like watercolor, it kind of takes the point away of gouache, in my opinion. It's definitely a lot easier. If I were to take this palette out traveling, it's a lot easier to use it for plein air sketching because it's a lot less messy than my Stay Wet palette. But then I feel like if I were to want something like dry gouache on a plein air visit, I would probably just use watercolor instead because I can kind of achieve the same thing from it. But that's just my opinion. I feel like maybe it's the colours I chose to put in my pans, but personally, I don't really see the point to the dry gouache because it just makes it act more like watercolour. And if I'm using gouache, I want brightness, I want intensity, I want nice opaque colours. But I know dry gouache is quite a popular thing, quite a few people use it. So it just depends on your art style and how you like to do paintings, I suppose. But yeah, that's my thoughts. I kind of feel like I've wasted my Holbein gouache by putting it in this dry gouache palette because I probably will rarely use it. I would always reach for my Stay Wet palette over it, but I've got it, so I intend to use it. It's just one of those things. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. Do you prefer dry gouache? Do you prefer wet gouache? It'd be interesting to know. Obviously, everyone has different thoughts and opinions. And let me know which side do you prefer. Do you prefer the doe or the deer? Well, stag. So yeah, I'll let you guys enjoy the rest of the video and then I'll catch everyone up at the end. Okay guys, so that is the dry gouache palette versus the wet gouache palette. Let me know what you guys thought. I had a lot of fun painting these and just comparing the two. Which side do you prefer? Let me know, it'd be really interesting to know. But thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and I will catch you in the next video. Make sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment if you did enjoy the video. Okay then, bye guys.